Hi everyone. So this video is going to be a Kickstarter for us to start our theory class on Edmund Burke's understanding and philosophy of what's beautiful and sublime. And before we start understanding the notion of beauty and sublime, it's very important to also know that in his book in 1759, what he does is adds the introduction or the preface of the first part of the chapter as sort of a beginning of understanding what we understand as taste. And he kind of explains this notion that we have this misunderstanding that we cannot by any way understand taste in a rational manner, and he believes that that's not necessarily true. We can always rationally understand what taste is, and what he does very interestingly in the text, and especially in the first part of the book, is explains to us from a very psychological point of view of what taste really is and what happens within our body and mind when we perceive something as beautiful or not so beautiful, or something as tasty as not as tasty, etc., etc. But the reason why I'm making this video is because I think it's very important to understand what the author is trying to tell us. Because when we try to understand the theory of sublime or beauty from the perception of this great politician, a theorist, and philosopher, we really have to understand what his take is on taste. But when we decide to learn or decipher the idea of sublime, beauty, and all that jazz, it's also very important to know what, aesthetics is in general. What do we really think about aesthetics? Um, it is a very common word, and I think I remember because around the 2020 specifically during the COVID, the word aesthetics or online aesthetics was really important. When you think about it in a very pop cultural reference, social media reference, everyone is quite busy to really understand what aesthetics means. And this notion of aesthetics happened in early mid 18th century. This is not a very recent factor, particularly because, Baumgarten gave us this notion of aesthetica, which we now called aesthetics. So Alexandria Baumgarten, when he speaks about aesthetica or aesthetics, he gives us a framework of what beauty is from a very sensory point of view. So the knowledge you're going to have is going to be particularly very sensory based. But on the other hand, Kant, he also gives us a very universal philosophical idea and a principle. So he not only reimagines the notion of aesthetics, he expands on that idea. But right in between both of them, Edmund Burke sort of comes in and he asks us what beauty is, not from a very rational point of view, but he explains to us and asks us and proposes us to ask ourselves what happens in our bodies and minds when we see something that's beautiful or sublime. And he makes us look into these notions from food to beauty to even vegetable to a certain point, and helps us to critically analyze our inner thoughts in doing so. And I believe that when we study this text, it's going to be very much effective for you to critically analyze not only text, but also, let's say, manga, anime, or horror films in general. It would sort of give you a new outlook into this notion. And you'd find that when he starts the chapter, he talks about how we often try to reason with different factors just so that we can bring our point across. So that's fine when we do so, because if you come and tell me that the earth is flat, I'm not going to believe it. It really doesn't make any sense because there is an objective understanding and proof that earth is not in fact flat. But if you tell me for a second that, the red color can be metaphorically represented with romance, I could also tell you that it represents with war as well, if I'd want to. So it's very subjective. So we have to understand that what Edmund Burke is trying to tell you is he's not trying to define taste in general, because he believes that he can't definitely define it by himself. But on the other hand, he kind of attempts to do it as well. So he's like in the middle ground of all of it when you think about it, because he says he doesn't believe in defining anything, because defining one aspect would give you an argument to bring across and believe that that is exactly what it's true. But he believes that taste is not subjective, but on the other hand, it's not entirely objective either. And, Burke sees taste as a faculty of multiple faculties. It kind of blends the senses and imaginations and judgments. It's like a mixture of all of it. And it is not purely subjective, as I've mentioned before. If that is the case, then rather it's the combination of, and he mentions this, that if you want taste, if you want to have taste, you have to have senses and the judgment of those senses. Sometimes sometimes you see people talking about certain films or clothing as tasteless. And when we say this is tasteless, what do we really see? Or we try to confine certain ideas, or we have these notions of something being absolutely bland. On the other hand, we see that those are not so bland or very exciting to look at. So what do we really see when we, put these certain labels? And Edmund Burke tells us to make sure to separate our prejudice when we decipher a form of art or literature or even food at the same time. For instance, if you're not very much familiar with a culture, you can't simply say, I don't like this painting because, I don't agree with the cultural references of the artist. Because we don't know the just simply, it's what he's trying to say is, don't be racist. And upon which he says, there is a clear line between prejudice and taste. So the judgment is really, really important. He brings upon these two components time and again. He gives you multiple examples. He uses examples of sugar, tobacco, opium, goose, hen, pigeon, all of those you'll find it in the text. Right, so I try to make things a bit easier for you. I've put forward a PowerPoint slide with a few images so that it becomes easier for us to understand. But before I showcase it to you and go back and study the chapter in details, we have to understand that what Edmund Burke is trying to tell us to have this sensory perception is you need to be able to perceive the qualities of a certain object, and you have to agree that part of it is going to be natural. So when you perceive the notion of a taste, it is not always going to be universal. For instance, sugar is sweet, and that is universal, and that is objective. But let's say your taste bud is really bland, and you can't taste sugar as great as you did before. Then it kind of sort of changes these kind of notions in between. You have sort of a drawback that sort of limits your quality or limits your ability to understand the quality of sweetness. So, for instance, someone who's colorblind, they will not be able to perceive a sense of art as, vividly as someone who can actually see all ranges of colors. And yes, there is always a possibility that a natural sensibility, let's say, can come with a lot of drawbacks. But what he's trying to tell you that, you can become very curious about a certain idea, but for you to have taste, it's very important that you repeatedly practice or are in exposure to good examples of beauty, art, and literature. For instance, if you want to be able to write poems, it's very important to read poems. And if you would want to write certain poems in a certain language, you'd have to practice that language initially. So that's why I think he doesn't necessarily say that taste is universal, because taste can't be universal because it might differ people to people, culture to culture. And it definitely, while it's not entirely universal, it can be based on a very common ground of human basis. Um, and that's how we're going to understand sublime and beauty and all that comes with it, right? Let's see. Okay, so you know how I was telling you guys that he doesn't really define taste because he's not a really big fan of defining taste in general. But I'll tell you something, right? Let me see, like for example, when I the word faculty here. I think I'm going to find right. So right over here, he actually does sort of define what taste is, and he says, I mean by the word taste no more than the faculty or those faculties of the mind which are affected with or which form a judgment of the works of imagination and the elegant art. And he thinks the most general idea of that word is to be very least connected to the particular theory. And what point he's trying to recognize out here is this, that, when you teach the notion of taste, it will become very difficult if you specifically say this is exactly what taste is. And this is definitely his attempt to showcase the certain idea. And when he says so, he says that, there are certain ideas that are absolutely universal to all of us. When you see white, you say it's white. When you see black, you say it's black. If you taste something and it's bitter, for example, dark chocolate, it's kind of bitter. No one's going to come to you and say, this is not bitter at all. You know what? This is actually really sweet. That's not what it's going to happen. But you will find that perhaps you would like bitter dark chocolate and your friend might not like it that way either, and that can change definitely. The variables really happen in aspect of your judgment and not your senses. So senses can be very similar. And this reminds me of John Locke as well, because when he has this theory of empiricist idea, his empiricist idea is we need to stop thinking that, people come on this earth with a predestined ideas, predestined knowledge, because that's not what it's supposed to be. Rather, they grow up having a certain sensory knowledge that can be very, very effective and really helpful. So when you're very skeptical of, let's say, dark bitter chocolate or watching horror films, it's particularly because your judgment limits you to do so, or simply because you don't want to do it, and that's absolutely fine. For example, so let me just give you this example right over here. Now, this was this installation, as you find, was done by Catalan, an Italian artist. And as you can see, it's just a banana ducked on the wall. And when you see it initially, if you look at it, you'd perhaps find it really comedic, and you'll find a comedy element to it. It's a very ironic representation of art in the sense, and you'd call it postmodern. But then if I give you this information that this art installation was once sold for $6.2 million, you probably no longer going to like it as much because you start questioning it. If you are an artist or a painter who is a very big advocate of painting, you'd particularly not like this as much. So there are certain references that can change from time to time. And what does Edmund Burke really say about it? He says that, you have to have two important components. The first component would be the senses, and the second component would be the judgment. And in between, sort of like the bridge of it all, is actually your imagination. So when you have these senses, the certain senses are going to be very similar. For example, if you have cake, you'll find it sweet. Children don't like coffee, or if you give a child, espresso, they wouldn't really enjoy it. And you can't force us to believe that no, miss, the child will enjoy espresso. I can assure you they won't. But an adult with time, as they, take certain shots of espresso that really kicks off their day, they might enjoy it. They might as well be addicted to it. And so the senses initially is bitter for the child and for the adult both at the same time, but the judgment really varies here. And he thinks that imagination plays a very important tool here because the power of imagination works as a unity. It, as he says, and I also repeat and quote him, it can only vary the disposition of the ideas it has received from the senses. Now, the imagination is the most extensive province of pleasure and pain, as it is the regions of our fears and our hopes and all our passions that are connected with them. Think about a very delicious dish, right? And you've waited the whole week to make this dish, and you're excited to have this dish because you cooked it by yourself. Upon eating it, you realize that you didn't really put salt in it, so it's really bland. While it looks it looks very appeasing, so it's very appeasing to the eye, to the sight. But once you taste it, you no longer really like it that much. It makes me think about Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach, because when he mentions that, when you look at the beach, it looks very beautiful, but when you listen to it, you see like the grating roars of the pebbles. I go back and think about it time to time, and that's actually true. Your senses can be very different, and then how you imagine or you have some perceptions can be quite different as well. All of this might seem very normal for us to understand, but I want you to think about the mid 18th century when these certain philosophical ideas could vary because people were highly religious and highly biblical in their thought process, and bringing in all these ideas was simply could be notorious, but at the same time quite intellectual to begin with. I'll give you a pop cultural reference that I think you'll enjoy quite a lot. This is um, so when you see this character, what do you think? If you initially started watching anime and if you started watching Jujutsu Kaisen, you realize, okay, a, he's a very well animated character, but he also can be known as a fallen hero. On the other hand, if you start using all of your senses, you say, Geto can, it's a very interesting drawn character, and he's very charming. And at the same time, as you slowly start watching each episode, you realize, oh no, something wrong. Why is he committing genocide? But at the end, you have to understand like what he's doing, or the fact that I'm calling him a fallen hero or a tragic hero instead of a villain has certain ideas that's connected to it because it's my judgment. If I had no concept of it, let's say, what a fallen hero is, a tragic hero is, or the concept of genocide or erasure of mankind is in general, I would probably never have constituted any ideas or identity with this character. I would just look at the character and say, very good looking, very nice, what's next? But that's not how I'm seeing it, right? It's particularly because Burke is trying to tell you that when you see a certain piece of art, such as this, when you see a piece of art, you'd notice that you would also add into your judgment and try to sort of notice what is happening. So, three of the components, your sense, your judgment, and your imagination, is extremely important. Why is it that, on pop cultural references, we find this character romanticized despite of things he had done, we know can be easily categorized as someone who's a villain. So, can we say that the imagination and the judgment are subjective? Absolutely. So going back to our text, he's also going on a sort of explanation on a tangent of taste in general. And he's explaining how we're all sort of are subjected to the idea or taste of sour, honey, sweet, bitterness, etc., and all these ideas. And we kind of constitute it with pleasure or pain. But, try to understand, how would you find pleasure and pain if you didn't have a sense of judgment? You would need a sense of judgment, right? And this is kind of the idea that really comes along time and again. So, cannot be distributed. What cannot be distributed? Sort of the taste in general. So I'll give you an example. You may not like the taste of jackfruit because of its smell or its texture, but it does not dispute the fact that it is unique in texture, smell, and taste, and it kind of stands out as a national fruit of Bangladesh. And it's really culturally quite significant in terms of identity as well. And so that's the kind of idea I would want you to sort of associate with when you do so. For instance, think about it this way. Again, you might love cats, but you're allergic to it. So you find yourself staying away from cats. Because you don't really want to fall ill, right? So there's these barriers that are sort of created between you and the subject is particularly composing of three ideas: your senses, your imagination, and your knowledge of that idea, right? So he mentioned something very interesting. And what he says is, he agrees that definitely in his mind, he cannot comprehend the idea that someone would prefer a goose to a swan. And that's he's like he can't believe it. That idea in his mind just doesn't work. He says, people would rather look at a peacock than look at a hen. So similarly, they wouldn't look at a goose and think, this is really pretty. This is prettier than goose. That's not how it's going to work because, in his mind, that doesn't necessarily register quite a lot. And sight is very important, as well as hearing can be very important because goose can be very notoriously quite loud. And he gives you the examples of tobacco, opium at the same time. The Turkish may like opium, it can be very pleasing to them, but on the other hand, tobacco can be a delight for Dutchmen. Think about pantabhat for an example. We really celebrate and like pantabhat, but then again, it doesn't really register to other people in different culture. And think about it this way, like eating with hand, there are many like specifically the West, they cannot comprehend the idea by eating with hand because they would rather prefer spoons and forks to hands in general. And this has not only become not a habitual difference, but this could also be identified with race and identity and uniqueness of belonging. And sometimes it can also be referred to otherness if we listen and we read from the very colonizing point of view. These ideas are very, very important when we study the notion in itself. And so when he does so, he also says the mind of man possesses a sort of creative idea where he can also, with the help of the senses and order and manner, combine certain images in a new manner and in a different order. And that is exactly what he calls the imagination. That's one I have sort of included in our slides as well. And in doing so, a certain subject can be absolutely new and it can seem very different to you. Like, for example, we may all agree that Sabrina Carpenter is really beautiful. She's gorgeous, but you may not enjoy the music, and some may really enjoy her music. Some may believe that, if you look into her recent album art, you might think, oh, okay, this is like a satire on the other hand, some may believe it's a poor choice of satire. So judgment really varies here as well, does it not? He also refers to Mr. Locke, by the way, because he agrees that Mr. Locke, when he mentions that there are certain business of judgment, really when it comes into this idea, your senses completely change from one way or the other. And I think this chapter is really, really interesting when we look into art pieces, music, and food specifically as well, because our judgments can be very different. The pleasure of resemblance is which principally flatters the imagination. All men are nearly equal in this point, and the principle of knowledge is very much accidental and it depends of experience and observation. And he says that, and I quote, that the difference in knowledge that we commonly, though with no great exactness, call a difference in taste precedes. So he has a specific idea. He says when it comes to similarity, the human mind is very similar because most imagination is based on resemblance. To find the resemblance sort of comes on with observation and experience. For example, it's important, and he mentions this in his chapter Novelty, it's very important that you don't pursue the subject with only curiosity. Because with time, if you're always constantly curious, and you never really act upon this certain curiosity, and if you just simply are curious about something and you go ahead and like it, there would be a high chance that you would dislike it, completely dislike it. And that's not going to be a really good experience. Now, is that going to be that's going to be very painful at a certain point, because he gives us an example. If I give you an example, for instance, if I say, if you're learning to play the piano because you're very curious and everyone else is playing the piano, that's why you want to play the piano. At a certain point, you might not be very good at it, if you don't excel in it, and if you play the piano for a week or two simply because you're curious and you're not passionate, then there is no pleasure in it. In fact, it's just going to be very painful in the end because you're going to be simply really bored, or you're going to procrastinate in your lessons, and the hurdles that will come in trying to perfect that certain hobby that you have partaken. If that's going to be a problem, that's going to be a problem. You don't want to do that. So he says the difference in taste kind of proceeds because while we find resemblance, we also find a lot of differences as well. All right. He gives an example of poetry as well. In poetry, other pieces of imagination, the same parody may be observed. For example, he gives the example of Donne and Virgil very coldly because these two men seem to have a different taste, and they kind of vary from each other. And if you want a very similar example, I would preferably give you the example, the main difference between Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, even though they are sort of contemporaries to one another, how they see romantic poems really varies in how they write the essays and their observations of romantic poetry in general. Or the notion of Ulysses. Ulysses or Odysseus is often reimagined in many ways. And once you reimagine it, you notice that the piece of imagination is very different. Another example could be, how do you see Superman? Do you see Superman from a very humanistic point of view, or a very heroic point of view, or a very godly point of view? All these notions are incredibly important and attached because how you imagine them is also correlated with your judgment. And so that's very important to know. So far, what does he have to say? So far, he has to say that taste belongs to the imagination. He gives in to the notion of taste being for the imagination. And he says that in the manner of being affected, nor in the cause of the affection, but in the degree that it kind of makes a difference. And that's what's very important. Let me go and look into the slides, for example. When you see this piece of painting by Joinul Abidin, you notice, if it, like I've mentioned before, taste can vary in culture and in different way that we perceive our identity. When we notice, we instantly kind of connect to the famine in Bengal in 1943. 1942 to 1943. And upon seeing so, we kind of sort of imagine and we try to understand it, and we feel a lot of conflicted emotions. But someone who's not very aware of colonization or imperialism or the notion of famine in the first place would have no idea, but would rather have an overall understanding. It would seem to that certain person or a viewer that this painting is about poverty, but this painting isn't simply about poverty. There are so many other characteristics, traits, and historical point of view attached to this piece of painting. And keep in mind, an art major would look into this piece of painting in a more critical manner, and critically they would analyze it by noticing the texture of the paper, the texture of the ink, and so all of it, they would try to find the contemporariness that really comes in with this painting. And this idea in itself is very, very important. For example, this piece of painting by Caravaggio, you notice that it's the beheading of John Baptiste, and there are many different paintings that Caravaggio has done. But if you weren't a student of art, you wouldn't really critically understand it, but you would look at it, you would appreciate it, but an artist would appreciate it in a different manner. An art student would notice it in a different manner. A historian would depict it in a different manner. So definitely taste belongs to not only the judgment, but also the imagination. Because in sensibility, feelings are often very difficult to describe and put into perception. And this is exactly where imagination, or the juxtaposition of imagination and the notion of judgment really, really comes in. And so with that, I want you to understand what we will study in the notion of pain and pleasure, and then we proceed to understanding sublime as well. Now, if you have any questions, you know that you can email me anytime. preferably before 8 p.m. I'll see you in class.